Onda UNED. Imagen y sonido, hasta donde estés. Un espacio de la Escuela de Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades de la UNED. Hasta donde estés. Onda UNED. Acortando distancias.
Muy buenos días, muchísimas gracias por estar en sintonía de Onda UNED, una transmisión que llega a ustedes como siempre acá desde nuestro estudio en la UNED de Sabanilla, pero que hoy conecta a dos lugares del mundo completamente diferentes. Hacemos una conexión tanto hasta Irlanda, que es virtual, como una conexión hasta Nueva York, que es presencial, porque estaremos conversando sobre un tema muy importante para el futuro de nuestra universidad y para el de todas las universidades del mundo, que son las microcredenciales, microcredentials. Eso es lo que vamos a estar hablando el día de hoy y cómo acreditar a nivel universitario el aprendizaje experiencial. Un tema muy importante, ya lo vamos a ir detallando poco a poco en esta conversación. Y como invitados tenemos tanto a Mara Huber, que es de la Universidad de Buffalo en Nueva York, y también tenemos una conexión hasta Dublín con don Mark Brown. Pero esto es lo último que diré en español. A partir de ahora la entrevista será en inglés. So it's a pleasure for me. Now we switch to English so that our hosts, our colleagues in conversation may understand what I'm saying. We are going to be speaking about micro-credentials and experiential learning and the badging of that, how we prove that experience is occurring. So we have this conversation with Mara Huber. She's from the University of at Buffalo in New York, and we have a connections with Mark Brown, and he is connected all the way from the Dublin City University, from that majestic, beautiful city of Dublin at the other side of the sea. And it's a pleasure to be with you both. So maybe we may start first with Mara speaking and explaining to us. We are used in here at UNED to a more traditional way of learning where you have a degree, you study for a few years, and then finally you get your desired title that tells that you know about this such and such career. What is the difference that you get when you begin to start by entitling micro-credentials? How we change that mindset, Mara?
Thank you. Well, first of all, micro-credentials and digital badges are very exciting, mostly because they're very dynamic. So you'll find many different versions of them. So it'll be fun to hear from Mark about how he's using micro-credentials. I can speak to my work at the University of Buffalo. So we know that degrees are still important and they're really necessary for many professions, but they're not necessarily sufficient. In order for students of all ages and backgrounds to find success and to connect their talents and their interests with opportunities to add value in the world, they need skills and experiences and competencies. And degrees aren't always capable of showcasing those skills and competencies or even really translating them to opportunities. So imagine micro-credentials and digital badges as these dynamic stepping stones that can connect a student where they are in terms of their own capacity and their own background in stories and interests, and help them connect with emerging opportunities. From my perspective, a great way to think about it is sort of mapping it backwards from the opportunity that you want to connect with and unpacking the skills and competencies that you can work towards. And then when you've achieved that skill or competency and you can submit some evidence, the badge actually becomes a symbol and allows you to share that evidence with important audiences.
So we first want to focus on the experience of what's happening in the EU, in Europe. We have the case of Ireland, is a country where many of the tech companies that operate in Europe have their headquarters. I think Google and I think Amazon as well has it. We have Ryanair. I mean, many companies, airlines, etc., tech companies that are in Ireland. How is that experience of micro-credentials and digital badges working there, and why is it important in a market where you have such sort of companies, artificial intelligence, IT, etc.?
Well, Ola, I would be remiss if I didn't begin, given that whilst I work in Dublin in Ireland, I'm originally from New Zealand. So I need to begin by congratulating Costa Rica on qualifying for the World Cup at New Zealand's expense. I think that's probably much more important than the discussion about micro-credentials. Joking aside, it is actually the fact that the sort of tech industry isn't really driving the micro-credential movement in Ireland or Europe more generally. They are an important stakeholder, and we actually have the European headquarters for LinkedIn, which arguably would be one of the most important platforms in relationship with industry. But the initiatives are being driven more at a government level and primarily in Europe by the European Commission. The European Commission doesn't have jurisdiction for individual countries' educational policies. I've had the privilege to work on the European Commission's high-level consultation group around micro-credentialing, and over a 2-year period, we now have a common European-wide definition of micro-credentials, because that's one of the biggest challenges we actually face. And some of the listeners today, we haven't actually talked about what do we mean by a micro-credential. Most of us understand what we mean by a macro-credential. You introduced it at the start. A macro-credential is like a degree. But the micro-credentialing movement is part of a wider unbundling movement, and that's probably for better and worse, depending on your perspectives. So to finish up, I can talk at great length about what we are doing in Europe and in Ireland, but I think it's fair to say that the work that I've primarily focused on has been more at the policy level and talking about micro-credentials. Putting them into practice is a lot harder than it sounds. I'll stop on that note.
Yeah, well, so we're going to focus now. We changed the side of the sea and we go to the United States. We now have this issue put on the table. It's not necessarily the industry that is driving it, but at least in the case of the European Union, Mark shows us that is coming more from the Commission of the European Union, which is also a level of governance that is completely different in the US. How is it working in the US? How is it the micro-credential? How are they being driven through the system, and how are you working with them?
Yeah, it's a little less regulated. It's sort of like the Wild West in a good way in the United States. So I can speak to my state, which is New York State. We have a public system, SUNY, which is the State University of New York, that includes 64 campuses across New York State. And they really endorsed digital badges and micro-credentials in a very sort of creative and inclusive way. And several years ago, it's been over 5 years, they put out a white paper to all the campuses across SUNY. and really encouraged campuses to embrace micro-credentials and digital badges in ways that were meaningful and aligned with their work. They did set out a common definition, and they talked about micro-credentials being smaller than degrees and smaller than traditional certificates. They talked about skills and competencies and alignment with employers and professional skills. But they really left it open for innovation. And my university, the University at Buffalo, is the most comprehensive research university in our state University of New York system. We really have been a leader at the university level, creating an office, creating our own framework, but then inviting the departments and the programs and the centers to submit proposals. We included micro-credentials, which are tied to credits. But we also opened it up to digital badges, which can be co-curricular outside of coursework. And that is really where I came in with my work associated with experiential learning. So I'm using digital badges for experiential learning. Departments are using micro-credentials to unbundle their degrees and focus on high-value skills and competencies. We have some groups working on workforce development and offering them to external audiences. So we're really experimenting with this idea within the broad context of a research university, which is very decentralized, with many different initiatives happening at the same time.
Okay, so Mark, how is it working in the case of Ireland? So you're using also the digital badging, or how does it work out there?
So I think a really important distinction needs to be made between what we're defining as a micro-credential as distinct from what I'd describe as a nano-credential, a digital badge. In the definition European-wide now of a micro-credential, there needs to be learning outcomes stated, quality assurance, assessment, and in our case, alignment increasingly with the European qualifications framework or national qualifications framework. In Ireland, we already have a national qualification framework that accommodates micro-credentials. It's quite unique that our framework already did that. And what's happening is the government has made a sum of around about 12 million euro available for the universities to collaborate through the Irish Universities Association, which is like a neutral body, or not entirely neutral, but at least a brokering agent. And so the universities are all collaborating with that funding, and there's a national approach. This is not dissimilar to what's going on in Australia, where I'm from, in New Zealand to a lesser degree. In Australia, there will be a national portal, an exchange that students will be able to find. And that will be the case in Ireland as well, that there will be some coordination and that learners will have some confidence around what the offerings are and the currency they have. Now, the word currency is really important here. Currency is a bit like money. We all understand the value and the currency of a degree, a macro credential. It's quite important that learners have a sense of what the value is and what the benefits are of micro-credentials. It's actually a very significant gap in the academic research in this area, because we know conclusively about the benefits of macro-credentials. Micro-credentials is pretty limited. It's actually pretty much a data desert at the moment.
So it's still a very new field. And as Mark is telling us, definitely it's something we need to explore, because I'm sure that when I have a degree, I go anywhere else in the world, and if my university has a decent level of acceptance, my degree would work almost anywhere. How do we begin to put micro-credentials as an accepted thing throughout the world? One could be, well, industry is one part, but it's not everything. How have you found this issue that Mark puts on the table?
Well, I think it's interesting because our work is in such different contexts. So when we designed our approach, we were really focused on experiential learning and this idea of helping students access high impact experiences while they were working on their degrees. So while many students work on research projects or they get opportunities to do internships, from an equity standpoint, there are many students who don't have those opportunities and may go through their entire education without really getting close to a community or the context of the work that they're studying. And so for us, it wasn't so much about translating degrees. It was more about enhancing degrees and maybe even elevating the relevance for some of these degrees that are no longer easily transferable. So we have students in engineering and there are jobs waiting for them, but students in some of the humanities and social sciences, it's no longer as easy to get jobs or to translate that degree into different contexts that aren't readily accessible. So we really wanted to utilize digital badges as a dynamic bridge between students and opportunities, which I think is a very different goal. And the goal of what you're trying to do is going to dictate the design of your system. So I think these are just two very different examples of how you can utilize, this approach.
Okay, thank you very much. Mark, I remember when I had the opportunity to study in the let's say Commonwealth educational systems. I studied in Australia and I studied in England. And what I found very different from Latin America is that in Latin America, the whole educational system is based on a list of courses that you have to take in order to have a degree, but those courses are fixed. But what I realized in the case of Australia, even at the level of college and high school, you start to choose your subjects depending on what you want to learn. And I found that in the university in England as well. So if you do a series of micro-credentials and you get to a level of credits, could you exchange that for a degree? Or how does that work? Is it a way of doing like little steps that take you to a degree that is customized to what you want to learn? Is that the issue? And maybe explain to us, how does that work?
Yeah, so I think the last comment there about answering the question why you're interested in micro-credentials, I'm going to give you a kind of a roundabout answer to get to your question. Maria raised the question around why, and your answer to that question, I completely concur, is going to lead to different outcomes. So what we know is that different institutions, different organizations are actually responding to the why question in different ways. Some see it as opening up access to education in the tradition of lifelong learning. That's certainly a very strong driver here in Europe. But equally, employability is a very strong driver as well. And in some cases, let's not fool ourselves. In some areas or jurisdictions, making new money is also a driver, and there's predictions of the kind of new market that micro-credentials might open up. So those questions, the answers to those drivers, are really important in the way you frame micro-credentials. Having completed a very major literature review last year for the European Commission in this area, one of the things that we identified is different institutions frame or position micro-credentials either as just supplementary, complementary to what they already have, so they don't really challenge the bundled macro credential, they're just an add-on. Whereas there are a limited number of examples where institutions and jurisdictions are trying to embed micro credentials as this new approach within the whole credential ecology, part of the macro credential. So your question was, where do they fit? Can they be stacked up to a macro-credential? Yes, they can, but that depends on how you're defining and framing micro-credentials. That's the importance of what's happened in Europe by aligning the micro-credentials into the European qualifications framework, where the desirability of stackability is very important in the way that Europe has approached its definition. But at the same time, that horizontal stackability doesn't rule out more of a horizontal, the vertical stackability doesn't rule out more of a horizontal approach, almost like a honeycomb, where people can do these short learning programs in areas of interest that might not link to employability. And then last comment to make is we shouldn't have think that micro-credentials are something new. They've actually been around for a very long time. And the best example I usually cite is 1833 in Canada. The St. John's Ambulance introduced for the first time their first aid certificates. Those first aid certificates attract in Canada 500,000 learners every year. They have very high currency. They are quality assured. And actually in 2019, citing some research here, 10,000 jobs required a first aid certificate in Toronto alone. So, that's an example of micro-credentials, except what I will say is typically those short courses with a vocational focus haven't really had traditional universities around the table.
So, given what Mark is saying, and it's a very interesting example, that one of Canada, I would even say, like, for example, I don't know, maybe the theoretical driving license course, for example, is if you don't have that, you cannot drive, and that at least that's how it's working here. So all of those things have usually happened sideways of the universities. Given the transformations the world is having, because we are having today, for example, I studied advertising in 2005, and social networks were not a really big player by then. Now advertising is unthinkable without social networks. So, and every profession has gone through that transformation. So is this micro-credential drive a way to kind of save universities from being too slow for the pace of development of what the people has to learn to be able to have a employability?
So being an administrator, I have to be very diplomatic. So I would flip that response and say it's an opportunity for new relevance, right? I agree that in some ways micro-credentials are not new, but the functionalities that they offer are new, I think, for traditional institutions of higher education. So I play with digital badges in terms of what they mean for the student, but I also play with them from the standpoint of dynamic assessment and this ability to be nimble, which you speak of. So if you step away from what it is that you're credentialing and you think about this opportunity to connect students who are studying a degree, and degrees are fairly rigid, right? I mean, even if you unpack them, they are fairly, they're I would say rigid and constrained. But if you pair those with experiences and specializations and exploration, that is the opposite of rigid. And you can integrate it in a way that you can credential it, you can capture evidence. I think you do have opportunities to do really interesting things. And from an assessment standpoint, the ability to be dynamic and nimble, but have consistent data and assessment is really exciting, because not only can you follow students throughout their education, let's say their undergraduate education, because they can carry those badges with them into LinkedIn, into the world of work, you can track their impact. You can stack impact to bigger goals and objectives. We connect ours to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example. And that gives us an opportunity to really look at higher education within the context of employability, job mobility, societal goals. And I think that is pretty innovative and exciting. So yes, I do think there is a new opportunity for innovation and for higher education to go in places that maybe we haven't fully gone before. So I'm hopeful.
Nice. So I'm gonna, at this moment, I'm gonna imagine in an imaginary way, I'm gonna stand in the midst of the Atlantic and and do like a little table tennis here. So we have Mark in one side and we have Mar in the other side. Mark, from what you have in the EU and what you know about what is happening in the United States, what would you like to have from the framework of what is happening in the US and be able to put it into Ireland that maybe, I don't know, regulations or whatever don't allow you to do it? What would you want to take from the US experience?
Oh, that's a very tough question. I think it's probably helpful to let learners know, or listeners, sorry, that fundamentally, with the exception of the United Kingdom, remembering that I'm an island, which is not part of the United Kingdom, that higher education in Europe is still fundamentally a public good. It's free for many people. In the US, it tends to be more of a private good with a higher fee charged for individuals. So the drivers for microcredentials are much more driven by individuals' gains than societal gains, notwithstanding the focus that I had on the Sustainable Development Goals and so on, which is great to hear that. So I guess if there's one thing we would want to take, it would probably be the culture of innovation that sometimes is stifled a little bit by both regulation and shackled in centuries of history. I say that with the greatest respect as a relative newcomer to Europe. I'll stop on that note.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mark. Now we go to the other side of the Atlantic. What do you want to take from the European experience and making that important, Mark? Yeah, Ireland is an independent country. Many people makes that confusion with the Northern Ireland. So what is happening? What do you want to take from the EU experience?
Yeah, I definitely agree that transparency is extremely important. And this idea of being able to translate and to stack, I think is an expectation that we all have to try to meet. Within our university systems, there's so much autonomy for everybody to structure their own programs and their own goals. But it's really up to the students to navigate that, right? And as they change majors, as they change institutions, that's a lot on the student. So I do really like this idea of continuity and clarity and specificity and being able to exchange. I think that's a really important movement. And I think that's something that we should embrace as well.
And in your case, Mark, since you also have the ANZ experience, what do you want to take from there? ANZ experience, Australia, New Zealand experience, to clarify to our audience.
You could say down under, as we sometimes say.
Down under. That
we're
works.
at the top of the world. It depends which way you see the world positioned. Firstly, I'm probably taking a quite firm stance around the value of having a degree of regulation in this without stifling innovation. So New Zealand was the first country in the world to incorporate microcredentials into the national qualification framework. Ireland has them, but by chance in the design of the national qualification framework. And that national qualification framework fits within the European framework, which therefore adds for portability of learners' qualifications. One of the things we don't necessarily recognize enough is that we think every degree is kind of the same, that we recognize once it's a degree, it has international currency. But actually, there is huge variability worldwide in what we mean by a degree. 3 years, 4 years, 4 years tends to be in the US. So we actually don't have a common language, even with macro credentials. So down under, what's happened between New Zealand and Australia, they've introduced alignment to their national qualification framework to embed micro-credentials in a way that challenges the 19th century conception of credentials in light of some of the things that have already been discussed, but hopefully not stifling that local innovation at the same time.
So we now spoke about three different kind of global north experiences. What have you seen in the global south that may be added to what, because we are in the global south, so it's good to see what other countries around the global south are doing.
Yeah, it's been interesting. So once we developed our model, which includes sort of a market, we use project-based learning, and then we use digital badges to support engagement, virtual engagement, but it could also be in person. I've been exploring different ways to utilize those tools. I take students to Tanzania, and we have a number of NGO partners across Africa who are doing the work of sustainability. And coming to Costa Rica and learning a little bit about your system here, I'm learning and I'm going to be exploring some of the centers where you have students who are in different territories doing projects and engaging with their communities around these priorities of ecotourism, ecological management. And so for me, I get so excited because I see the reach of your university and I see the potential of your graduates who are going out and doing amazing things. But often it's difficult to assess and it's difficult to support and catalyze in a way that it can grow and really have an impact. So I see the world through project-based learning, and I see the world through digital badges because it gives us so much potential. So for me, it's just been such a treat to learn about the diversity of the ways that you engage students and to help envision a system that could give that some structure and allow students to sort of build on those experiences, but also allow the university to sort of optimize that. So that's the lens that I bring to this work.
Okay, so in your case, Mark, how do you see, or what projects have you found in the Global South that catch you in a way?
Well, the way I often think of this is, if micro-credentials are the solution, what is the problem? And the problem, I think, is different in different regions. So an example, in Ireland or most of developed parts of Europe, the micro-credential focus is more about continuing education. People who already have macro-credentials, who need to upskill, the changing nature of work, enhancing their employability, and so forth. So we're talking more about postgraduate, bridge, or continuing education. But in developing parts of the world, and I am familiar with your higher education participation rates in Costa Rica, perhaps the problem is bridging people from secondary level education into further education. That might actually be the most powerful way in which you could strategically invest in micro-credentials, not focusing on those who already have macro-credentials, but actually trying to increase participation rates in education further, higher, tertiary education being the term that's international to cover the general areas of higher, tertiary, and continuing education. So for me, you have to understand local solutions for local problems.
It's very important what you are marking here, like to take the solution from the problem. And I think you are quite right. Have you been to Costa Rica? Because what you are showing, or what you're telling us, Mark, is especially for our sort of university, which is focused on mostly on rural education or giving higher education to rural areas, is more of the problem we have here. That how do we inclusively add these people to a higher level education system, since the opportunities are not usually there. So very important what you're saying. I was catching, but Mara, but what you were saying about digital badges. So explain to us, how does that work, and how is it a digital badge a trustable thing in 50 years? Like, how, if I get a digital badge now, how do I know in 50 years it's still going to work?
Yeah, so the way that we, again, use digital badges is somewhat unique. For us, it's this idea of building value around skills and competencies, right? And there is nothing sort of automatically magical about that badge. It's what you do with it and how we cultivate that value. So imagine, students working on specific skills related to research or related to community assessment. And if they achieve that competency, they then get access to other opportunities. So think of it as like a token economy that you can continue to build. So our students, for example, work on experiential learning projects, either mentored research or global collaboration or innovation. We have a framework that they work through to gain context, to gain certain skills. And when they work through that system and achieve a certain level of competency, they then upload their evidence, which is vetted by faculty. So it's vetted by the content experts, depending on what they're doing. They achieve that badge that then can give access to other opportunities. So how do you know the badge is meaningful? You know that it's meaningful by what the student is able to do with it. So the student is leveraging the badges for scholarships and fellowships. But it's not just the badge itself, it's what they're doing to earn the badge. So they're reflecting, they're developing narratives about what they've done. They're integrating it with their skills and competencies and degrees, and they're demonstrating evidence. So for us, it's the entire engagement process that leads to the badge, and then the value that we are creating around the badge.
So I do like a project, I receive a certain badge because of sort of what happens like in the scouts or things like that, that you receive badges for your specific achievements in your projects. And also my project is put up by the faculty. So you have the support of the faculty, you have the badges, you have the project. So when the employer or the whoever is retrieving that information can come and see what you have done and what sort of things you have achieved, but that can be like backed. It's not like a portfolio that I put of what I have done. It's something backed by the faculty.
By the faculty. And then we measure. So what's interesting about our use of badges is we can compare metrics of students who haven't gone through our system or any formal experiential learning with those who have. And we can actually look at the effects on retention, which is a big focus internally of universities. We can look at student success. We can look at certain groups of students who drop out of school because they don't have that connection with mentors. Mentorship is important. And then we can follow the badges and see if students have used them to get jobs, how it's affected them in their choices. So for us, it's not the badge itself, it's the experience and the process going into the badge. The badge becomes a symbol of that. But if you imagine it from sustainability or from innovation, if you had students working on projects where they are responding to certain needs or community needs or ecosystem needs, you should be able to track the badges with your focus of impact. And as soon as the badge becomes a proxy or a predictor of impact, that badge is very important for an assessment system as well.
So it's also involving sort of big data research, because once you have the badge, you can track the use of that badge in real time.
You have a through line that you could then optimize. And one more piece just to share with you, it's the learning experience for the student, but I also happen to believe that the talent that you're developing through these opportunities has important impacts for communities and innovation. But we often don't have a way to track our educational programs with the outputs of our students and then their impact in terms of innovation in society. That's not something that higher education is very good at.
Well, thank you. So now I go to the other side of the sea. Mark, tell us, how is the micro-credential model, like in practice, happening in the experience you have? Like, how does it work? When we now had the experience of the badges and how they are implemented in the case of Dublin, how is it happening?
So I think there's a lot more talk and rhetoric than there is practice. So it's great hearing, from an institution that's got a really big commitment to this area. What we're seeing is a degree of parallel to the MOOC movement. If you remember, 2012 was the year of the MOOC, according to the New York Times. Arguably, 2022 is going to be the year of the micro-credential. I'm seeing a degree of academic colonization by more elite universities suddenly getting involved in the micro-credentialing movement, shall we say, because of the fear of missing out, more than FOMO, rather than thinking about why and what their intent is. And so I think it's fair to say you've got a very mixed approach to micro-credentialing. My current interest is around how an institution develops a strategic response to the micro-credentialing movement. One response is to do nothing. Actually, I doubt that many institutions will choose that option, because that's how important and how the micro-credential movement has just grown exponentially. But what type of leadership do you need? Who needs to be part of that team? What sort of institutional structures are required? What business models are possible and that would be fit for your institutional purpose? There is a dearth of literature about this. There's actually a dearth of published literature with really rich case studies, possibly because we're still so new and institutions are so busy doing it or trying to do it. So for me, I think you have to be very careful if people listening are interested to develop micro-credentials. You need to think about this very intentionally. There are important decisions to make. Pilots are always a good thing to try what works for you. In many respects, what's a bit sad in terms of the published literature. Now, the published literature might not reflect what's really happening in practice on the ground because there's a gap. But in the published literature, 85% of the examples that are provided, and I'm citing this major literature review, were single institutions engaging in their own micro-credentials, essentially unbundling what they already do and doing them in more creative ways. Sometimes actually not that more creative at all, just offering modules as part of their degree. Other business models, like working with a consortium, or working with an industry partner, or with a OPM or OPX, a MOOC platform and so on, because MOOCs should not be underestimated as very important partners in this space. Very few examples. We hear a lot of rhetoric about those opportunities. The one thing my own institution is doing, the European Commission, again, playing the role it does, is encouraging consortiums of European universities working together. So we have 12 universities, including, in addition to 12 universities as part of the European Consortium of Innovative Universities, and the 13th associate partner is Tec de Monterrey. We're working to offer micro-credentials across our partners. as added value. So not just providing something from our own institution for our students, but offering a truly collaboratively designed European microcredential or suite of microcredentials. And yes, ours are also designed around the sustainability goals. So that's a different example, but your original question is what's happening in practice. That is quite rare.
May I?
Thank you very much. Yeah, you were asking for it.
Yeah, it was such a great answer because you touched on so many of the challenges. I'm a researcher by training. I'm a cognitive psychologist, and when we designed our system, we designed it as a system, right? And this goes back to this question of why and how. We created a system to develop outputs that were important for many reasons. And we did the work as a team. We had a very small team. There were only 3 of us in my office, of clarifying our goals, clarifying the constraints, and building the system. And then we piloted it. And as we learn, we go back and we tweak the system. We're learning from our system. And when I talk about our system, I think there's a real danger because people want micro-credentials, but they just want to buy them, right? This idea like, okay, we want to do it. Give us your system. Well, our system was designed for us, right? And Mark's system is obviously very different. So I think there's a real opportunity to design systems that are effective and powerful by design, but we have to treat it as such an opportunity and not really miss the opportunity by just doing the same and, unbundling and putting them into modules, which has happened with some of the programs at my university, and expecting magic to happen. Because that's not what this is about. So thank you for letting me add that.
No, thank you. But yeah, we have been trying to create a technical degree for transmedia production in this university. Mm-hmm. So that's an experience of what we are doing. And we have found it so hard to create a degree that has no forced structure on it. Mm-hmm. Like if you just want to give a menu to people and allow them to choose, and you have a certain amount of credits, and then you have a degree because you have a certain amount of credits, just undoing the idea of a structured course and degree and change it to this idea of allowing people to choose is like talking about of the like UFOs, you're talking about something outer space. So since you have seen how it works in your universities and in other places, what sort of steps innovators in a university have to take to begin to be able to put this idea in the mind of people, to do the inception of this idea in the mind of the people of the university, and allow the structure to allow this sort of thing? So maybe Mark first. We are gonna unmute you. Yeah, there you go.
I'm going to come back to the issue around thinking very intentionally and strategically about what you want. In the innovation, particularly the business or engineering literature, there's a very important distinction made between H1, H2, and H3 innovation. So H1 innovation, if what you want to do is just some supplementary short courses, because that's really what they are, if you want to put it in plain language, in English at least, you might incorporate them within your existing structures and just build them into existing workload models and existing teams that you have. H2 innovation is much more challenging, where you want to disrupt the way you've done your, in inverted commas, business previously, to do it in a very different way. But it might still mean that you take an internal structure and you add to it in some form, because that structure already exists. You've got maybe a center for lifelong learning or an online learning unit, depending upon the nature of your university and how you see them. H3 innovation, which you don't see much at all. Actually, you don't get anyone talking like this, to be truthful, in the microcredential context currently, is where you would set up a commercial entity outside of the university structures to run this in a way that isn't shackled by the regulations and challenges that universities face. And it would run in a more business-like way, but actually it could be a business. Now, there are some examples around the world of how that has been done, but they tend to be private providers that have done that. So those are kind of, you've got choices and you have to think this through as what's best fit for purpose. What we're seeing, and it was really interesting hearing that Wild West analogy before, is how do we tame the Wild West? What kind of leadership and structures will help us tame that? And true to what I've said previously, there isn't going to be a single fit for purpose here. The only perhaps advantage I think we have in Europe to help tame it more than perhaps some other places is we do have a good number of countries all working to the same general rules and guidelines and procedures. And then we haven't talked about this previously, but platforms do matter here. Normally, I'm not that interested in the technology because you can find the technology, think about what you want first. But in Europe, all roads lead to what we call the Europass, which is where all learners, all citizens in Europe can store their credentials, and including their microcredentials. So interoperability with the Europass is this one place, and it can also map to the European skills that are identified. So platforms matter, both distributed platforms, but also centralized platforms. Ideally, some interoperability is the crucial part.
Interesting, that part of interoperability. So Mara, go ahead.
So I would say yes to taming the Wild West, but not sucking the innovation and creativity. And I think there's a balance here for having some consistency, but not worrying so much about the uniformity that we take away the interest. I think that's one extreme. The other danger is giving it away to outside vendors. I have vendors contacting me every day wanting to partner with our university. And that means they want us to sort of give them, use their platform. And I think, you know, higher ed has a responsibility to be part of this innovation. So to answer your question, I want to use my model. What we have done is we decouple into some dimensions to make this more dynamic. So the first is what counts to be a project, or what counts to be a trajectory, or whatever it is that you're trying to do, and giving enough structure to it that that there's some consistency. But for me, it's about holding up the skills and competencies that you want the student to master and to explore, but giving up some control of how they go about doing it. And the reality of it is there's so much available now through open education, through Coursera, through digital badges. There are a million ways to learn. As a cognitive psychologist, I cannot pretend that the only way to learn is to sit and listen to a professor. I'm sorry. It's just not, right? And so how do you help the student explore through whatever vehicle works for them, but as a university with faculty and professors and researchers, help them integrate their experiences with their learning? And I do believe there's room for both. So holding up structures for engagement models, how are you going to help students move through learning, using open education resources, using other means, and then having some vetted evidence and competencies and feedback, I think is the way to go. Just as an example of how this can be done, when the pandemic hit, all of these in-person experiences were shut down across our state university system. And so we got together with COIL. I don't know if you've heard of COIL. Stands for Collaborative Online International Learning. And we got together and we used the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are just such a wonderful framework, to invite students to explore. And we had faculty create modules of open education resources through whatever lens they brought through their background. We had students explore storytelling modules, which reminds me of your question. So some explored graphic novels, some podcasts, and these were students who had more academic backgrounds, but they explored the lenses through open education resources. And then they connected with real communities and NGOs across the world using virtual engagement. And they had rubrics and they had goals. And then they tried to put all of that learning into motion and create something that could be vetted and that added value. So the challenge is on us to clarify what we're trying to do in a way that is clear, that a way that could be measured and tracked and endorsed in a way that would be meaningful. But I think the work is so exciting and so important. And I really hope that our colleges and universities take the opportunity to be innovative and to think from a design standpoint using these badges.
Well, we are reaching almost to the end of the time we have for the interview, sadly, because this and the interview is heating up, so I like that. The discussion is getting very interesting, but I want to do a last question to both of you. We are in a moment where the development we are doing as human beings and the way the world is changing so fast is bringing us a lot of challenges. One is artificial intelligence, which is changing everything and is gonna likely take many jobs that are very important now. Even jobs are as basic as lawyers, general physicians may have to think about changing their careers because of artificial intelligence and technological disruption. And that could create a world where humans, many persons that have trained themselves may find that what they learn throughout their lives suddenly becomes irrelevant. Mm-hmm. And irrelevance is one of the challenges. We have less jobs and more risk of having a lot of people being irrelevant. So how important is this transformation of the mindset of the universities towards micro-credentials and digital badging, taking into account these huge changes that we are having in the world now? So Mark first. I'm going to put you...
You cue me to... could accuse me of saying as a slogan, but I'll say it anyway. I frequently use this as a quote. Micro-credentials are not the big idea. They need to be in the service of big ideas. And, you know, we've actually touched on the sustainable development goals here. I'm not that confident that AI is going to solve the climate crisis that we face, the poverty crisis, the distribution of wealth crisis, that 8 men in North America can own 50% of the wealth in the developing world. Technology is not going to solve that problem. It can be part of a solution. So I am concerned that we are thinking too narrowly about micro-credentials, the language of micro-credentials. Let's talk about what the problems are and the solutions that micro-credentials, along with other innovations, might help us resolve. Also, when we talk about work, because, and I am very respectful in the Costa Rican context, you know, work is very important. But there is a distinction here between paid work and unpaid work. There is no shortage of work in the world. There's plenty of things to be done. And there are lots of people, particularly women, who do work that does not get paid or recognized. So we have to change our thinking about what is valued and the importance of what I'll describe as the learning society as distinct from the knowledge economy. Albeit you need a knowledge economy to pay for the learning society. I guess I better stop because I see the time is ticking by.
No, thank you very much. The good thing about social networks is we can take a little few minutes more. But so Mara, your stance is...
Yeah, I think this is really about, I think education is really about developing talent right? And being able to direct that talent, not just to where it's needed, but to create growth and innovation. And I love being in higher education because we are so uniquely poised to do that. I think the value of, for me, the exciting part of digital badges is the translation and creation of value, and connecting needs and opportunities. Once you're able to set that up, you can learn from those patterns of activation, which is what AI really is. And you can optimize and you can continue to develop. I think the interplay between higher education, the economy, the environment, that is all set up to really work in synchronicity with that. And I think digital badges and micro-credentials are a way to do that if we allow them to be used in that manner. So I think it goes hand in hand with where technology is taking us. And, as we've set up our system and we've seen the impacts, we have 99.7% of our students who have earned badges have been retained. We see growth in all of these competencies. So we can actually use some of these dynamic assessment tools to optimize our own system and to connect it with the needs of the world. So I'm really excited about it.
Well, thank you both. I know this issue may take many hours more of discussion, but time is ticking. So thank you very much, Mark, and a big hug to the Dublin City University. Enjoy a whiskey in the jar for us. See you.
Bye-bye.
And thank you to Mara. Oh, thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.
And thank you to Mara Huber from the University at Buffalo in New York. Thank you very much. And also thank you to, y muchas gracias a Maynor Barrientos también del Proifed por traer a estos investigadores a nuestra universidad, a nuestra UNED, y poder tener estas discusiones tan importantes para nuestro país y el futuro de nuestra universidad, máximo en un momento en que estamos redefiniendo el estatuto orgánico, que tenemos congreso universitario en estos días. De verdad, muchísimas gracias por además hacer esta conexión internacional y por atreverse a hacer una primera experiencia de microcredenciales en nuestra UNED, de la cual vamos a estar conversando en el futuro. Así que nos despedimos de esta transmisión de Onda UNED a los dos lados del océano Atlántico. Muchas gracias por habernos sintonizado y nos escuchamos en cualquier momento a través de ondaunet.com.
Onda UNED. Imagen y sonido hasta donde estés. OndaUNED.com. Espacio de la Escuela de Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades de la UNED. Hasta donde estés. Onda UNED. Acortando distancias.